All right, now for this part of the material on voting, campaigns, and elections, we'll talk here about one campaign in particular, the campaign for the American presidency. We'll look at the various stages of that process, and as often as possible, we'll make reference to ongoing issues, ongoing um, dynamics in the Republican race for the nomination. Now, 16 candidates engaged in that. And then on the Democratic side, of course, five, although Hillary Clinton seems to tower over all the rest.
First thing I want to talk about here when we're talking about the long campaign for the presidency is this thing called the invisible primary. That's a sense in which the battle for the nominations of the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, it begins super early, like at least 2 years before the general election, right? But it's often not the official start of the campaign season, but it's the unofficial de facto start, the so-called invisible primary, where the various candidates are starting to make their plans and they're jostling for position with one another. They're doing interviews with the media to build up credibility and profile. They're starting to reach out to major donors and strategize for their small donation campaign for how to raise money, which has become increasingly prolific in recent years. Often, early days, if you're thinking about running for the presidency, you're going to come out with a book that tells your story to the American people. You'll go on a book tour. You might prioritize some of the early states in the nomination process. That would be New Hampshire and Iowa and Nevada and South Carolina, a number of others that are pretty early on in the calendar. There has been an effort by the Democratic National Committee to reshape that calendar, right? Because the Democratic Party feels like, why should New Hampshire and Iowa go first, right? The standard Democratic electorate, you don't really see that in those two states, right? These are relatively conservative, very white states, right? And the Democratic Party is not conservative and it's not particularly white, right? So their argument is just because that's tradition, right, the way it's always been done, doesn't mean that it always has to be done that way. So then DNC has been trying to reshape the calendar to prioritize other states going first, states like Nevada and South Carolina. And they're trying to push New Hampshire and Iowa further back on the calendar, deprioritize them. Now, New Hampshire and Iowa are fighting back. The outcome of that is not yet clear. The DNC could penalize states that refuse to go further back in the calendar by either not giving them any delegates at the national convention or giving them fewer. But the DNC doesn't want to do that, right? Because they'll need the support of these states come November and the general election. So it's all quite drama-rama here, but we'll see. But even if Nevada and South Carolina don't get to go first for the Democrats, they're still quite early on in the calendar. And right, Nevada and South Carolina better fit the Democratic Party in terms of racial diversity. I don't think the RNC has done anything on this front. They've avoided that battle with the states. If you're a candidate considering running, you're looking to line up people with experience running a campaign. There's only so many of them out there, right? So you're going to try to corral the best ones early, get them lined up for your campaign. And then at the end of all of this, as you start to get closer to officially declaring your formal candidacy, you form what's called an exploratory committee. I think it's required by law. And then you make your official declaration. Trump did this, right, super early. He did this right after the midterms of 2022. I think for at least two reasons. One, he was anxious to get started. He's been anxious to get started since he lost in 2020. So some of it is that, sheer anxiety. And then I think some of it was, right, he wanted to be able to argue that if he was going to be indicted by the Department of Justice or the state of Georgia or the state of New York, that if that was going to happen, he was going to want to be able to argue that they're doing it because I'm a candidate for the White House, right? So, and that's exactly what he's done, right? He's used that early declaration as leverage. Hey, I'm running a campaign here. Is that why you're coming after me? All right. So, in terms of earning the nomination within each of our two major parties, we have a series of primaries and caucuses, increasingly primaries and fewer caucuses, which are kind of an odd beast. You can check it out in our text or Google it. It's a little bit arcane. Primaries tend to be better in terms of much higher turnout by we the people. Caucuses tend to be a little bit exclusionary. Far fewer people participate. Hence, I think, sort of as we democratize in a variety of ways, yeah, there's been a push more towards primaries instead of caucuses. Um, Something to note here, I can hardly emphasize this enough. Historically, the party elite within each of our two parties controlled who the nominee would be every 4 years. I mean, tight control. Okay. Um, that tight control is largely gone. It is largely gone in the modern era. But that is an anomaly historically. People don't appreciate that. Helps to know our history. The big shift was really 1968, Chicago. Uh, Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democratic president, had chosen not to run for re-election because of his unpopularity due to the Vietnam War. He had Americanized it. It was really his war. You buy it, you break it, as Colin Powell used to say. So he bought it and then he broke it. Uh, so he stepped down. Right. So the Democrats were in a bit of a quandary. Who do we nominate if not the incumbent president? Right? Well, next best thing, right, would be the incumbent's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who was a good dude, very pro civil rights like LBJ. But he also, in a sense, right, took ownership of the Vietnam War as LBJ's number two. So the party elite said Humphrey has next. You know, he's the vice president. We're going to go with that. Uh, all right. Democrats, rank and file, ordinary Democrats across the country, were not happy with this. We're not happy with this, right? Because they were the ones increasingly agitating against the Vietnam War. And so we're deeply skeptical not only of LBJ, but also Hubert Humphrey. But back then, there weren't that many primaries and caucuses, and they weren't terribly meaningful. It was, again, pretty much the party elite who got to choose. Um, so this does not sit well with ordinary Democrats across the country. It doesn't sit well with them at all, right? They feel like they have Humphrey getting shoved down their throats. Who did they prefer that year? They would have preferred Robert Kennedy. John Kennedy's brother. He was the choice of we the people. But again, back then, primaries and caucuses didn't amount to much in terms of delegates at the convention. They could nominate the more popular candidate. That was pretty marginal. Who controlled the delegates for the most part? The elite. And then, of course, tragically, Robert Kennedy uh, gets assassinated in California towards the end of that process of primaries and caucuses. In fact, it was in California. Uh, so again, kind of tragedy strikes, and there's a bit of a void. Eugene McCarthy has next in terms of being anti-war and popular with ordinary Democrats, rank and file across the country. Eugene McCarthy was the anti-war candidate. He was the popular candidate among ordinary Democrats. So we go to the convention that year in the summer, Chicago. Mayor Richard Daley, is running the town. And the elite are determined to choose Hubert Humphrey over Eugene McCarthy. Well, the anti-war movement moves to Chicago. Ordinary Democrats who want McCarthy and not Humphrey converge on that convention. Richard Daley is in control. He was very, well, I'll just say pro law and order, pro law and order with a vengeance as a conservative Democrat. And it goes badly at that convention. It goes very badly. Um, Humphrey is chosen, is forced down the throats of we the people within the Democratic Party. The protesters get a bit out of hand. The police get even more out of hand. It's a riot. It's a free for all. There's tear gas. There's batons. There's beatings. There's media coverage. It's a disaster for the Democrats. And yet they still get Humphrey, who's not a terribly popular candidate among Democrats. Right? And then, of course, Humphrey goes on to lose that election to Richard Nixon, albeit by a narrow margin. This is a recognition, I think, by the Democrats. This cannot happen ever again. This was a disaster. This sort of set us up for a loss in the general election. We had the elite forced down our throats, an unpopular candidate. This is no good. So then the elites within both parties start to cede more control to we the people, voting in primaries and caucuses. And today, right, that's become simply the dominant method of selection. Ordinary Republicans, ordinary Democrats, choosing who they wish rather than who the party elite might wish. Remember, Donald Trump in 2016 was an outsider, right? The party elite within the GOP said anybody but Trump. And who did they get shoved down their throats by we the people? Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump. And it worked out for the GOP in some ways, right? So something that today we take for granted has only really been with us since the 1970s. And now really the elite within each party are somewhat marginal to that process, much to their frustration. So I cannot emphasize that enough. So in terms of now where the action really is, primaries and caucuses, right? Within each party, you need to campaign hard in those primaries and caucuses. I think they typically begin in about February or so of the year that the election is taking place in November. It takes place over several months. A few states here, a few states there. Nevada is one of the earlier states. Conventional wisdom is the earlier states have more influence because they can get sort of momentum going for a front runner. That's not necessarily true, but it's the conventional wisdom. And that's how it's done now within each party, right? Very competitive series of primaries and caucuses spread out over several months, all geared towards choosing delegates to the conventions in the summer. The Democratic National Committee Convention, Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, DNC, RNC, and then you crown the winner of the primaries and caucuses at these conventions. That usually is late summer, and then you slide into the general election in the fall.